You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Joining us right now is Jim Hanson, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy, which you can go to their website. But Jim, I know you have a Twitter handle. I believe it's, correct me if I'm wrong, Uncle_Jimbo.
That's me.
So, first of all, welcome, but we want people to follow you on Twitter because, well, one, you're a great guy. I'm sure you have a lot of interesting things for people to follow you about.
I appreciate that. It's a fun place to tell the truth and harass those who don't.
Exactly. It is kind of fun sometimes, but you can get carried away, too. Not you, but just, using social media. But
oh, no, me.
Jim,
me too.
Jim, we've had the pleasure to meet you and speak with you with regards to, all the national security issues and defense and things of that nature. So, again, thank you so much for joining us for the conversation today. John and I enjoyed, we had to watch it in different clips and whatnot, but the center had put on a summit on extremism, and you had a wonderful panel, and you could tell us about some of the people that were on there, of course, and things of that nature. And, of course, I would recommend people going to the Center for Security Policy and watching it. I want to say it was a little over 5 hours.
Yeah, almost 6.
Yeah, I know it was pretty long, but it was excellent. And so, first of all, thank you for putting that on. But after having done that, I guess we have a lot of questions, but let's start off with, did you learn anything that was surprising to you from the comments from some of the guests and people who participated? And could you share with us the major theme that our listeners and people should be really looking to on this issue? And then, of course, we'll get into more later as to what we could do about it. But we know that's very easy. Contribute to the Center for Security Policy and follow you guys and call your members of Congress, right?
All of that sounds good to me. I think that if I was going to tell you one thing, you can tell what we were about by the name of it. It was the Defeat Jihad Summit. It wasn't the countering violent extremism conducted by unaffiliated individuals randomly shooting people for no reason. We know who we're fighting. We know the name of the enemy, and we're perfectly willing to name them and to take the fight to them with military force and with every other organ of government and U.S. power. And that's really what happened at the summit, was we got together some of the best minds who share that sentiment. And we basically schemed for a day about what should be the U.S. plan going forward. The Center for Security Policy, we have the Secure Freedom Strategy. It's a 100-page document that tells how we want to fight the war against the global jihad movement. And that's not just the terrorists, that's people like their enablers, the Muslim Brotherhood, CARE, the Muslim Affairs folks, all of the affiliated groups. But it was nice to actually get all the best thinkers in the room and hash that out. And I think we've got some pretty good ideas.
I was able to catch the vast majority of that, Jim. And I have to say, I thought, first off, it was very fair because you had people from all different directions. You also had people from various areas around the country. So you had pluralist Muslims, for example, like Zuhdi Jasser, who has really done some fabulous work on high-risk work, trying to take on his own people to some of the more extreme, like Earth out of Europe, some of the more extreme guys who are pretty much just cut and dry. Islam's no good, and it's got to go. But I think the most important takeaway that I had was that the overall breadth and quality and experience of the people there was significant, and everybody had something I thought of value to contribute. Now, counter that to the charade going on right now at the White House, and I'm going to guarantee you that all of those great thinkers, not a one of them was invited to the Joe Biden, charade parade going on now.
Oh, no, and I think it was the one thing I heard was, and first of all, you're absolutely right, that not only were none of the people who understand who the enemy is and how to fight them were invited, but they invited plenty of people who are in bed with the enemy, who are part and parcel of the global jihad movement. They may not be cutting heads off but they are fighting a stealth jihad. They're using lawfare. They're using all the nonviolent and pre-violent methods of jihad to go ahead and infiltrate our society and use our freedoms against it. But there was a Canadian minister I heard today who called it by name. He said, look, this is a global jihad. Let's call it that. Let's do something. And I guess they didn't throw him out. So that may be a bright spot in an otherwise dismal affair the White House is throwing.
Now, do you have any sense that some of the Islamic countries, even or let's call them Muslim majority countries like Egypt, for example, who have now really taken direct blows and indirect blows politically under Morsi before Sisi took the country back over, that some of these folks will actually help stem the tide? Or do you think that to a large extent they're just trying to temporarily placate their own population because, nobody likes the public embarrassment and having their people, butchered on social media?
It's sad that there's an element of the latter, but I do actually believe that we can co-opt some of these folks. Morsi, when you talk about in Egypt, they threw the Muslim Brotherhood out. They deposed them. So I think there is the capability to make alliances with them. I don't know that they're part of the larger, a good ally in the larger actual cultural war. But there are two elements. There's the fight against the jihadis in the field, where we need to kill terrorists to win. And then there's a larger cultural battle. So I think at least getting their help, stacking dead tangos like cordwood, and killing as many ISIS and the rest of those guys as we can is a good thing. But that alone, as noted Brainiac Marie Harf said from the State Department, is not, we can't kill our way to victory. We need a broader strategy. The problem is the White House isn't even willing to start with the killing the people that should be killed part.
Well, you can't fight a war without boots on the ground, right? Even though there are boots on the ground.
Occupying Iraq again doesn't sound like a good idea, but maybe a thunder run through the Sunni tribal areas where the problems are, and then packing up and leaving and telling them pop your heads up again and we'll make the rubble bounce. That may not be the worst idea in the world.
No, but Jim, even to the president's point, though, if you don't want to have boots on the ground, then why didn't we support the right people in Syria at the beginning of that civil war? Or why didn't we do the right thing in Egypt before we allowed the Muslim Brotherhood, which I know the president wanted that result. But, just think about it. It's like you can't have it both ways. You can't say, we're going to deal with this, but we're not going to put boots on the ground, but we're not going to support somebody else's boots either.
And you can start with the fact that he pulled us out of Iraq, creating a power vacuum that allowed Iran and ISIS to go ahead and become the forces that run that entire area. So I don't know that he's made a good decision as far as national security goes in his entire tenure. He makes decisions based on politics. He's got political tools on his National Security Council. So he disregards the advice of his military leaders. He follows the advice of poll-watching political tools, and the result you have is a world on fire and a high likelihood of a very bad situation when Iran gets nukes and the whole Middle East goes up in flames. So he's not doing too well in my book.
Well, I would go a step further, and I agree with what you said, but I actually think he's doing this on purpose, and I think one of his main strategies, which he'll never admit to, was to allow Iran to become more powerful and take control of that region. I don't think he has any intention of stopping him from a bomb, regardless of what he says. And I think that a lot of these things are done on purpose, and it's not in our interest. I have no idea whose it's in. I want to ask you a question because going back to the summit, and I know you'll comment on that too, but I just want to throw this question in there because one thing that got mentioned and discussed in the summit, which I thought was really interesting, was some of the studies and reports based on the education that goes on within the mosques in the communities, where they were trying to figure out, well, what percentage of radicalization is actually covered. And I was shocked to hear, and I'm going by memory, and there was a lot said, but I seem to recall that they said it was somewhere between 80 and 90% of the mosques that they had studied found that there was radical speech and things being taught to the people who attend them and in these schools that people attend.
Yeah,
and this
how
is
about
in the
those
United
moderates,
States.
Huh?
Right. And
I mean,
this is in the United
we've
States.
been infiltrated. The infiltration has occurred. It's underway. They're readily going ahead and indoctrinating their troops. And again, they've been at war with us since the Iranian Revolution. And as far as your point about Obama and Iran, I'm not in disagreement with you. Everything he's done shows that is the result of his actions. So either he's incompetent or it's a cunning plan. And it may not be a smart cunning plan, but it might be his. And I think that, given that that's what's happening, looking at that front and the home front, we're well behind in this war. And so that's part of why we have a declaration of war, a draft declaration of war, and an authorization to use military force in the Secure Freedom Strategy that we're giving to every member of Congress. We've briefed some already, and every one of them will get a copy of our strategy that lays out in detail how to fight and win this war, this full-on war, not just the terrorist piece. And hopefully they will at least take on the idea that we need to declare war on the whole movement and then use all of our assets and power against it in the appropriate places.
Jim, I'm still hopeful that we will win this clash of civilizations in the end, but I really, the more I watch, and we've been well over 10 years we've been studying this, but probably 4 to 6 years, fairly in depth and watching the tides as they move around the country. And it seems to me that, unfortunately, even on our side, we have a lot of people who mischaracterize the president as a nitwit instead of being nefarious. And I think it's greatly, as much as it's a risk to be unwilling to name your enemy, I think it's equally a big risk to not be able to identify that the president cannot be trusted based on even just looking at his own domestic policies. What he says and what happens in reality tend to be two entirely different things. With that as a backdrop, and I don't even need you to comment on it because I know we're in agreement there, but with that as a backdrop, don't you find to some degree that long before we can really effectively fight and win against this civilization jihad, as your boss would like to characterize this, that we actually have to first fight a war against our own people, meaning the democratic leaders as well as many of our allies around the world, particularly in Europe?
Yes. How about that? Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it's just that simple. You're absolutely right. And fortunately, we have elections. And part of the center's mission is to educate people. And I think the tide has turned. I hate to take the fact that things are so bad, so many people have been slaughtered, so much horror has been paraded before the eyes of the American public. Just what's happened overseas, let alone the things that have happened here, beheadings in Oklahoma, the guys running around chopping heads and yelling Allahu Akbar in America. I think the American people's eyes are open, and I think they've had enough. And the numbers are turning our way, but it's always hard to focus people in an election when you've got the entire media democratic complex lying and administering aid and comfort to the enemy in this fight. So, right now the White House is part of that effort. Fortunately, we get to fight against them in 2016, but we are really deeply involved in educating people about the fact that it doesn't matter whether they're Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram or anybody else, ISIS, call them what you want. If they fly the black flag, they are one enemy. And we need to treat them as that and then watch their enablers, the Muslim Brothers and the rest of those, and fight them on the legal battleground and cultural battleground as well. And if we do that, I too am hopeful, and more than hopeful. I know we'll win. The question is how long. We're not going to lose to these, medieval obscurantists, as scumbag George Galloway of England likes to call them. But he's right. They are medieval. They are barbaric. They can't compete against us once we get in the game. And that's what we're doing now, is getting people in the game.
Well, hopefully these the great research and efforts that you do will help to effectuate that, because I think what you just described happening in the U.S. and what we're witnessing happening throughout Europe, be it in the U.K., in Denmark, in France, in Germany, et cetera, is akin to what happened in Israel this summer. You know, I was in Israel, if you recall, and left the day before those 3 boys were taken and slaughtered by the same, the same evil character animated by the same book over in Israel. And that, while each one of these deaths is horrific, in a sad, ironic twist, in some way these guys are unwilling heroes in a war of civilizations, because it's these evil atrocities that unfortunately seem to be required to wake up the sleeping masses to what's going on. And with that in mind, I want to make a quick transition, because I haven't really seen much of this discussed yet at the Center for Security Policy, but I know you guys are one of the few people that I've seen actually tracking what's happening in Central and South America. And I wanted to make note of Russia has now actually been declaring that Russian armed forces are returning to Latin America. Of course, the Democrats still don't want to admit that they were there until Reagan tried to force them out.
Well, and add to that, the Iranians have been there and are deeply entrenched in all kinds of places. I mean, the Iranians and the Argentinians just assassinated Niesman, the prosecutor who was going to rat out that government and talk about some of the collaboration going on there. So we've got enemies in our hemisphere, no doubt about that. And I think, again, you mentioned unwilling heroes or unwilling martyrs. These people may not have set out in every case to be that object lesson, to the sleeping American giant, to our own populace, but they have been. And I think you were dead on about that. And I think that we owe it to them to capitalize on their slaughter, to capitalize on the bad things that were done in order to make sure more aren't done later. So I think you're absolutely right. The danger is here in our hemisphere. The danger is here in our country. The danger is in the White House today. Today, the vice president and the rest of those people at the Countering Violent Extremism Summit are collaborating with the very people looking to undermine Western society. So I vote against that. I hope everybody votes against it. But we need to first make sure everybody understands what we're fighting and the techniques and tactics and strategies that will be successful, because we can win this war.
Jim, in my radio career, I've had the pleasure to interview quite a few people who have participated in your roundtable discussion. I just want to give some of the names so people could have an idea of just how wonderful this panel was. But Louisiana's Governor Bobby Jindal, former Attorney General Michael Mukasey, former Speaker Newt Gingrich, Senator Ted Cruz, Representative Steve King, and Mike Pompeo, all of which have been on our program at some point. Andrew McCarthy, Admiral James Ace Lyons, General Jerry Boykin, Gert Wilders, who we've met but haven't yet interviewed, and so on and so forth. But you have a fantastic lineup of people here who discuss this issue. And, I just want to, I don't recall if this was mentioned in the discussion or not, but there's something that rings in my mind if you go back to the Major Nadal Hassan terrorist attack that happened at Fort Hood. And I call it workplace violence, but those aren't my words. That's the administration. That's how they termed from the get-go. You think about it, from the get-go of his administration, they were intent on ignoring the actual national security threats and trying to make things into what they aren't. And that's why we find ourselves here nearly 6 years later, depending on which timeline, which event we're looking at. And I agree with you what you said early in this interview. We are looking at a much graver situation. There's fires all over the Middle East. You can't find a country what's the safest place, to be in the Middle East right now? Where would you want to go on vacation outside of Israel? Really nowhere. Maybe.
I'd go hang out with the Peshmerga in Kurdistan, only because you may not be 100% safe, but at least you're with an ally fighting the enemy.
You may actually be safer in Afghanistan right now than almost any other Middle Eastern country.
Oh, that's awful. Hey, one thing you mentioned, all right, and you said that you framed it perfectly. Since they got into office, Obama's been trying to euphemize away the fact that our enemy is Islamist, extremist, radical supremacist, terrorist scumbags, and calling the shootings by an Army major who was radicalized at Fort Hood, workplace violence, was grotesque. But here's where I have hope. They just awarded all those, from that incident, Purple Hearts, admitting that it was a terror attack, admitting that that was not simply, a man-caused disaster. So the public outcry about that was part of that. So I think, you rouse the American beast and it will stomp you flat. And again, that's where my hope lies, is the truth is on our side. We are fighting on the side of right and justice and all of that. So I think given that advantage over Obama's attempt to euphemize away reality, we are in a better position. We just have a heavy battle because the bulk of the media and the rest are against us. So be it.
I want to make one more point before we close out. And John and I have a cousin who was a command sergeant major who served at Fort Hood. He's been overseas for forever. He's now since retired, but he was on Ray Odierno's staff. And he literally left Fort Hood to go to, I believe, D.C. about a week before the Fort Hood attack happened. And just in having conversations with him, he was so harmed by that. It was devastating to him because it was his home. It was his, first of all, it's his army that he's in. It's his brothers. It's his sister. It's so close and personal, and it's so insulting. And I say that because you've served our country, and thank you so much for all that you've done. But how does it impact you and the other brave people who've sacrificed so much for us and our freedom to know that the commander-in-chief does the things he does and acts the way that he does, which is anything but having your back?
It disgusts people, all right, and that's not an unfair characterization. In the military, you respect the rank, you respect the position. You do not have to respect the man or the woman. And he lacks the respect of the vast majority of the military for exactly that reason. They know that he made political calculations when he sent a surge into Afghanistan and got an additional thousands of our troops killed and tens of thousands wounded for political purposes only. He had no intention of winning that war. He announced our withdrawal date the same day he announced the reinforcement. So they've known since the day he took office that he didn't have our backs. And because of that, you salute the rank, you do not salute the man.
That's true. Well, Jim Hanson, thank you so much for joining John and I today on the Final Say Radio Show. Again, Jim is a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy, and you can go to their website, centerforsecuritypolicy.org, contribute, support them, and help them out in this incredibly worthy cause. And, of course, you could follow on Twitter. It's Uncle_Jimbo, and he would love that, the follows on Twitter. And, again, thank you so much. We appreciate the time, and we, of course, always have a welcome invitation on the program, and look forward to having you again soon.
It was a pleasure, gentlemen.
All right. Have a great afternoon. Take care.